In this video, we're going to look a little more at symbolizing quantifiers. So this is the universal quantifier, right? And then it means, of course, that this formula P here inside the quantifier is true of every object in the universe of discourse. So symbolizes English words like all, every, any, each, and so forth. So sentences like all my exes live in Texas, every city has more than 1,000 residents, each of these comic books is highly valuable. It would symbolize all of these with the universal quantifier. There are several different ways of paraphrasing universal quantifiers. So the way that the book does it is with the phrase each x is such that. And note that traditionally such that is abbreviated ST. So you can just do that when you're paraphrasing. Now, each x is such that is kind of an awkward phrase, but the advantage of using it is that it forces you to phrase your predicate in basically the same form that it will be in your symbolization key, right? So like all cities have a professional sports team. This will turn into each x is such that x has a professional sports team, which is basically what you're going to find in your symbolization key, right? Every city is north of Miami. Each x is such that x is north of Miami. Now, another way of doing this, though, um, so the traditional way of reading the universal quantifier is for all x, right? Like this is the way that people will typically speak this if they're trying to, you know, read out a sentence of PL, right? So if you paraphrase this way, then what you'll have is all cities have a professional sports team. For all x, x has a professional sports team. And this is, this arises from the fact that if somebody was trying to read this sentence, the way it would usually be done is for all x, px. Um, so you can symbolize this or paraphrase this way as well. This has the advantage that it's shorter. Um, but what really matters, of course, is that you just find a paraphrasing method that works for you. So, whatever you choose, just find something that's going to work for you and go with that. So the existential quantifier, that means that P is true of at least one object in the universe of discourse. So the thing that it corresponds to most closely in English are phrases like at least one, there is a, and then some, when it occurs in compounds like someone or something, right? So stuff like at least one of you passed the midterm, there is a city north of Miami, something lives in this hole. These are all very clearly sentences that would use an existential quantifier. Now, some often has a connotation that there's more than one thing that satisfies the predicate. Um, so you take, for example, some magic cards are highly valuable. Right. The implication here is that this is plural. There is more than one magic card that is highly valuable. Right. That particular card in the image there, that's sold for over $500,000 US, but it is far from being the most expensive magic card that there is. Um, we simply symbolize these with the existential quantifier in PL, right? PL can't actually symbolize this plurality. You can do better than that with an extension on it that's called PLE. Section 7.5 of the textbook talks about this, but we can't deal with that in PL. So all we deal with here is just that there's at least one of the cards that is highly valuable. What's probably the best way to paraphrase existentially quantified statements is there is an X such that. This also gets your predicate in such a way that it's going to be the same as in your symbolization key. So there is an X such that X is north of Miami. There is an X such that X lives in this hole. But of course, remember, just find a paraphrasing method that works for you. Now, quantifiers can be applied to truth functional compounds too. So take, for example, there is a city that has more than 1 million people but doesn't have a professional sports team. That is a picture of Austin, Texas, which does have a professional soccer team, but this is Texas. That's just the wrong kind of football. So I don't know if anybody's even noticed that the team's there. So the way you would Well, first, the way that you would paraphrase this is something like there is an X such that X has more than 1 million people, and it is not the case that X has a professional sports team. Notice the parentheses there. You're going to need those to show that that quantifier covers this entire section here. And then here's how you would symbolize it, right? There is an X, and then you have MX and not PX, all inside parentheses to indicate that that entire thing is being covered by that quantifier. All right. The next thing we should look at is what happens when you negate quantifiers. So first of all, when you negate a universal quantifier, a negated universal means that it is not the case that P is true of every object in the universe of discourse. So what this symbolizes is phrases like not all, not every. So like, for example, not every city is north of Utqiagvik, right? You can paraphrase this. It is not the case that each X is such that X is north of Utqiagvik. There's going to be your symbolization. Note that this is true. Utqiagvik is the northernmost city in North America, which means that, lots of cities are, no cities are north of Utqiagvik. And so it follows then that not all of them are. Now, so this means that it's not the case that P is true of every object in the universe of discourse. And so what follows from that is that P is false of at least one object in the universe of discourse. Right? It's not the case that P is true of every one of them, so there's at least one object that P is false of. And then what that means is that this is actually going to be equivalent to this, right? The negation of the universal quantifier is actually equivalent to saying that there is an X, not P. So here's an alternative way that you can paraphrase and symbolize that sentence, right? Not every city is north of Utqiagvik can also be there is an X such that it is not the case that X is north of Utqiagvik. Okay, now negated existential quantifiers. This is a much stronger claim, right? If you negate an existential quantifier, what you're saying is that P is not true of even one object in the universe of discourse. So this corresponds to English no, none, nothing, and not any. Note that not any is a negated existential quantifier, despite the fact that any most of the time is a universal. So for example, no city is north of itself, right? It is not the case that there is an X such that X is north of X. And so you get that symbolization. Now, if P is not true of even one object in the universe of discourse, then what follows from that is that P is going to be false of every object in the universe of discourse, which means then that this is going to be equivalent to this, right? For all X, P is false. So here's an alternative way of symbolizing this, right? Each X is such that it is not the case that X is north of X. So you've got these two alternative symbolizations for both of these, and both of them are fine, right? Like they're both equivalent. Either one is perfectly acceptable. So this is how you paraphrase quantifiers and also how you symbolize the negations of quantifiers.